The third UK Communities Conference took place again at Braziers Park in Oxfordshire during July 2024. It was a well-attended in-person event that was enjoyed by many. The Intentional Communities Research Group has been running symposia since 2014. Their 2024 symposium became a part of the UK Communities Conference, with live sessions every evening that were also streamed online to participants around the world. On Saturday, July the 20th, the symposium morphed into a book launch for the newly published second volume of the Diggers and Dreamers Cohousing Review, with contributions from Martin Field of East Midlands Community-Led Housing, who took on the role of guest editor, Ben Brown of GraceWorks Gardens in Nottingham, and Penny Clark, who's a Diggers and Dreamers editor and has been a member of a developing co-housing group. The session was chaired by Chris Coates, who is a founder member of the Diggers and Dreamers team and who lives at Forge Bank community.
So I think I'm going to make a start. I can see that people are gradually arriving in the room, and I suspect, having been at Braziers now for 3 days, that it will slowly fill as people finish their dinner. So welcome and welcome to the final of the 3 sessions. So this evening we are doing the book launch for the new Diggers and Dreamers Cohousing Review in Britain. We have a number of authors in the room with us. In fact, we have more authors than I was expecting in the room with us, which is wonderful. But our invited guests are here, plus Chris Coates, who is chairing the session this evening. So for those of you who might not know, Chris Coates is a member of Forge Bank Cohousing in Lancaster, and he is also a member of the editorial, a founding member of the editorial for Diggers and Dreamers. So welcome, Chris, and thank you for chairing this evening.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. So welcome to everybody. I'm going to be fairly informal tonight. We've got 3 speakers, and I'm going to invite them initially to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to launch into. We've got a few questions on the sort of that we've dreamed up to kick things off, and then if people have got questions, can you put them in the chat, and we will pick them up, and I'll try to sort of decide who I think is best placed to answer them. We've got Martin Field, Penny Clark, and Ben GraceWorks Gardens, it says on the screen. And people have written different articles in the book. I have a copy of the book here, which is going to read. Oh no, it's not going to read backwards. Very good. I thought we'd be in mirror image. So I'm going to invite people to just give a quick introduction of who they are, what their connection with co-housing is, and then I'm going to ask Martin to start. Martin was invited to be the guest editor, and ask him to just do a bit of background on what was the first edition. This is the second edition of our co-housing review. The first one was done over a decade ago, and Martin was the guest editor on the first one. So do you want to just give us a quick intro, Martin, on your background in co-housing?
I can do that very shortly, because I've been interested in co-housing for a long time, nearly 40 years, I suppose, one way or another. And so very happy to talk to people about it, to visit places, to learn more, to promote it. My work now in community-led housing sector is about supporting all kinds of community-led neighbourhood schemes, including co-housing. And Ben from GraceWorks is one of the recent collaborations that we've been having that's proved successful. We put this other book together thinking of this question when some of us were writing the co-housing guide, when we were commissioned by the UK Co-housing Network. We were very conscious that guide, apart from being an introduction to co-housing for people who might not know too much about it, it needed to really draw from people's lived experience now. I'm very conscious that a couple of years ago, that was already 10 years since the previous book. And so we were drawing from first-hand experience for the purpose of that book, but could see the value in yet another volume of what people have been doing since then. In a dozen years or so, there's been a whole range of different sorts of co-housing projects successfully establishing themselves. And it really felt like it was a brilliant opportunity to put another summary together to tell people about what's going on. And it's never finished. The minute we finished this book, the minute we were printing it, another scheme's finished in Sheffield that we haven't got around to talking about, although we included a picture of it at the very end of the book to say, you know, the future's already happening. So it's brilliant to have the chance to put together these sorts of biographies. And there's authors on the screen, you know, Monica from Bridport, Phil from Cannock Mill, and others, you know, to get their details in their own words of what they went through to put their schemes together. It's priceless. That's what we knew would be the case, and that's what we think we've ended up with.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Ben, do you want to follow that? Give your introduction, say a bit about GraceWorks.
Yeah, I'm Ben Brown. GraceWorks Gardens, a new co-housing community that came online. We moved in October 23, so we've been there less than a year. We're multi-generational. We've got 8 acres of land, so we're doing some land-based work as well as the co-housing.
Thanks, Ben. Penny, do you want to do a bit of a quick intro?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Penny Clark. So my first connection to co-housing was through academic research. A few years ago, I did my PhD looking at environmental sustainability and types of communal living, and co-housing was part of one of the types of communal living that I looked at. During that time, I became part of the Diggers and Dreamers editorial team, and that's given me this wonderful opportunity to be one of the editors of this book. I also have a little bit of personal experience with trying to form a co-housing community. So I spent probably 2 or 3 years part of a forming community in London. So that's a community that's still looking for a site. But I moved house recently, so I've now left that group. But that was in itself a really fantastic experience.
Okay, thanks, Penny. I'm going to try and do a bit of a broader introduction. Just there's a sort of assumption everybody knows what Diggers and Dreamers is. We've been around for quite a long time. We go back to the 1990s, and we run a website and directory of intentional communities in the UK. We also produce a number of themed books, of which this co-housing review is one of them. And the others are on low impact living, and we've just last year launched one on urban communal living. But the co-housing one is the second one focused on co-housing. And I'd quite like to ask Martin, who was the guest editor on both books, why a second book? Why a second book now? Why? What's changed in those decades?
There's more schemes that's come forward in that decade, or 10 or 12 years. So there's more for people to read about. There's more for people to be inspired by. Probably fair to say co-housing's been more prominent within the community-led housing sector, because that sector's in the recent years has had very genuine support from government policy, trying to promote different kinds of housing development and neighbourhood development. And so co-housing's been amongst that, and have maybe come to people's attention more than it had in the past. Certainly much more at this time for this book than a dozen years ago for the first volume. Still, sometimes gets the notion of co-housing gets interpreted different ways by different people and different starting points, different motivations. And again, it was an opportunity with this book to try and pull together what people have been doing with co-housing principles and values. What's been inspired by co-housing, even if it's still in the process of pulling things together, you know, like GraceWorks Gardens, with the land they've got and the planning permission that they're seeking. So it seemed a good opportunity to get people to write about what they've been doing, to say what they found particularly useful for their own success and put that in the context, in the sense of what's been changing for community development at large. And one of the things I'd say that has got a bit more difficult in recent years is what's made building difficult for everybody, that it's become so expensive and land has become monopolized to a bigger extent. You know, it's, people say you can't build, you know, land is land, and they're not making any more. There's plenty of land out there. It's about who has it. And it does seem sometimes that the who has it is being monopolized more and more to an even greater extent than it was a dozen years ago, unfortunately.
So you've been talking there about things that have changed. Is there anything that hasn't changed in that 10 years?
People's appetite to want to create communities for themselves hasn't changed one bit. And to my experience has always been that people's starting point has remains people coming together from a whole range of backgrounds, wanting to try and craft something that can be inclusive, even if sometimes that proves too difficult for the final project to actually achieve. The starting point always, in my experience, has been a whole range of different peoples and household sizes and ages wanting to do things collaboratively and just trying to find the best way of doing that in practice. That hasn't changed. Okay,
Ben, does that resonate with you? Is Martin's description of what the motivation is? Does that resonate with you and the GraceWorks project?
Yeah, very much so. We were I think there's two parts to us. There was a part that it comes out of an old charity that we're already involved in. And that was, we need to attempt to create something to sustain something like home and family or household and community for people that have lost theirs. And then there's a wider group of us as well that were looking for a shared community life together. And we wanted to create some of that had affordable housing and supported houses within that mix. So it's definitely about that coming together. And I think what Martin said about finding land and building being affordable is what makes us the community we are now, because we shifted from where we were originally to now. So we've gone for a site that was already had buildings on it. So it's an old farm, which had already got some of the outer buildings converted, a barn and the stables, converted into units of Airbnb. So it's given us a greater amount of housing at a much more affordable cost. So yeah, definitely can resonate with what Martin said.
And is that what, I mean, you were one of the contributors to the book. Is that what you wrote about in your article?
Yeah, and that journey of going from those different stages, I think that's the interesting thing is you start out with a vision. And I was chatting with somebody earlier at Braziers Park about this. We started off with a vision. At one point, we were going to build from scratch greenfield site, and we're looking at the idea of perfect green buildings. And so the group were looking at that, and then obviously as that land fell through, we then were looking at another site, and one at point was much more like here at Braziers. It's one very big manor house-like building. But again, for various reasons and covenants on that land, that fell through. And so it was that motivation to go, actually, we want to do this. I think we got very aware from the other communities we talked to and some of the housing groups that have been looking at land for a long time, that because of the situation of our families, particularly, we needed to move now. We needed to move this on. So we had to say, what are those compromises? And for us, it was a compromise of finding buildings that already existed, so we could start working on it. And that is kind of that journey that we show of how we got there in the book.
Yeah, I mean, people often say that finding the land is the biggest hurdle almost. Is that your experience? Was it? I mean, you seem to have made the compromise, if you like. I don't know whether it was how much it was a compromise, but driven by time and those sort of pressures, that the land needing to get a site became the biggest hurdle.
I think definitely in terms of, I think it's not the site actually that's been compromised. The site we've now got is fantastic. It's the location. So we wanted to be in Leicestershire. That was the original aim. And we moved to basically ending up after those first couple of attempts of finding land during putting a pin in and going for an hour circle around Leicestershire and looking around there. And now we're in North Notts. So that was that compromise in the end, is that feeling of needing to move, which means that there are a couple of people that are less likely to be involved long term because it's further away than they hoped. But Leicestershire is considerably more expensive than North Notts. And there's just hard to find land in Leicestershire that's available. So that's where definitely that compromise was made.
Okay. Penny, I mean, I know you came to co-housing from a research background. Would you like to explain a bit about your article? I mean, you were looking at some of the potential problems of not particularly finding the site, but in moving forward in development and particular options that were available.
Yeah, sure. So my article was about looking at the role of housing associations and developers in helping co-housing groups and how more involvement from them might lower the barriers of entry into co-housing. So what the article looks at is how have developers worked with co-housing groups, how housing associations work with co-housing groups as well. Why would these parties want to work with each other? What are the benefits? And then also, what are the difficulties of working with one another? You know, there have been partnerships which have gone wrong for various reasons. And what can you do to do your best to mitigate against these risks? And then I also looked at, beyond that, what are the risks to the co-housing sector at large by working with larger organisations? So what I explored specifically was this idea, could involvement with larger organisations, quote marks, dilute the co-housing concept? And then I finish off by talking a bit about what I think the possibilities are or the potential is for the sector with more involvement from developers and housing associations. And overall in the article, I think I am positive about the involvement of developers and housing associations, but I'm also acknowledging the difficulties and the risks as well. And if I may, I'll just go on to say briefly about why I wanted to write this article and why I found the topic interesting. So I honed in on a fairly specific topic, but more broadly, I wanted to look at that question of how do you take something that's quite fringe and radical, i.e. co-housing, and bring it to more people and make it that bit easier to do, but also while being cautious that in doing so, you don't take away those things that make it special in the first place. So in the article, I use the phrase scaling conscientiously and well. And I just in general find that a really interesting topic. You know, you can see in the book, and people often say co-housing communities often have these absolutely epic origin stories that quite often last over a decade. So Ouch is often cited as taking, I think, 18 years from concept to people actually moving in. And the people who do it are frankly heroic. But at the same time, I don't think it should be this hard. So my article is about, can working with developers and housing associations lower the barriers of entry to co-housing and bring co-housing to more people?
Okay, great. I'm going to throw out a very general question to anybody from the group panel here who might want to pick it up. People may have noticed we're sitting in rather we're all actually in the same building, but in different parts of it. So Penny and Ben are downstairs, me and Martin are upstairs in the library. People might be interested to know, that we're at a place called Braziers Park, but my question is, what's the difference between this place we're sitting in and co-housing? What, anybody want to have a go at that one?
Interesting. Yes, so we all discussed as editors what our kind of versions of defining co-housing was, and it was a really interesting conversation because we all came at it from slightly different angles. One thing I'll throw out there is I think at Braziers there's more sharing of spaces together, so there'll be more people sharing bathrooms or sharing a kitchen, whereas in co-housing you'd have your own self-contained home and then communal space as well. That's one thing I'll throw in there.
Martin, Ben, any comments?
I'd echo that. I'd echo that in terms of saying co-housing's distinction to me has always been about recognising, as the Danes have always said, that people like being private. Or if they value being private, then they value the privacy of self-contained accommodation. But that doesn't need to exclude sharing and doing things in common and doing things communally. And having communal facilities, particularly the common house and co-housing schemes, as an addendum, as an addition to domestic space, but a shared domestic space amongst all the households, seems to be what particularly characterises it from other kinds of neighbourhood development. And it's an internal sharing space as well as gardens and external. So it's not simply a garden area. It is something that gives people the opportunity to do intimate things together, like eating meals and having functions indoors.
Ben, what communal spaces have you got at GraceWorks? I spot we've got an echo.
I'd say you broke up there for a second. Just ask the question again, Chris. We didn't hear the question here.
I was going, what sort of communal spaces have you got at GraceWorks?
So we've got a communal kitchen and a communal lounge and a communal dining area, which is all in the downstairs of the farmhouse. And we do eat together every day. That's part of our kind of co-housing commitment as a group, that we wanted to actually be eating together. So obviously not everybody is there every night, but we cook a meal together every day. So and that's, I think, one of the things that really inspired me. I was saying to Martin, was that it was the Danish community, and if Martin wants to say the name, he can, because I can never say the name.
You're talking about Jernstøberiet, which means the iron factory. It was a reconditioned factory back in the late 70s, I think, or early 80s.
Yeah. And that really inspired me. And that was because it was really practical. I think often when I've been in intentional community seminars and things in the UK, sometimes they seem very aspirational. And I think it was when I first learned about that community and was listening to somebody talking from there, was a woman recently divorced with 3 kids, and needed somewhere where she didn't feel isolated and where there's some support. And they had a shared meal together every night, and her kids could come home from school. There was other kids around. There was older people in the community that supported the families and the kids as well. And they were saying that they'd not got their own kids and they really appreciated having those children around. So for me, it's that, you know, we have those shared spaces and we have that common life, and we've got about 8 acres of land as well. So we've got a lot of growing land together, and a lot of garden spaces together that we're obviously not really yet got to develop, especially because obviously Nottinghamshire flooded in October. So we moved in and literally, I mean, Martin abandoned us, I have to say. As our first communal event, Martin was like, the fire brigade said, you're either getting out of this village now or you won't get out tonight. So Martin left, went over the bridge, and then asked me, can you get my daughter to me? I don't want to drive the car back across. But yeah, we've got a lot of shared space, and I think we're looking at some community space. We've got some external buildings. I think we've got those 3 tiers at the moment. We've got that communal space that's for the community that live there, and we've also got a larger space that we're going to use as a kind of a community space. We're going to develop as a community shop and a kind of community space that we've got on site. They'll be for the public.
We've got a comment from somebody saying, in terms of what's the difference between, I suppose, in response to what's the difference between Braziers and co-housing, is that you have your own front door in co-housing, where in the sort of, I don't know what you call it, more classic commune setups, you've got a communal front door. I would say we've got both in Forge Bank. We've got both a communal front door where we can welcome guests to the community, and a personal front door where I can offer a sort of welcome guests to my own house. So there's also a question that sort of follows on to that, which you might want to start off on, Ben. It's sort of, can a person living in co-housing pursue an individual lifestyle? So do they have to sort of conform to a sort of collective lifestyle because it's about living together, or is it possible to live within a co-housing community and have I assume a lifestyle that may differ from other members?
I think you can have both. I think I know my wife's in the other room at Braziers listening to this.
Oh, so be careful what you say.
So Rue goes out to work full time and is off site doing that. I think it's an interesting question how you answer. I mean, we are very much as a community, we were committed to some of the Danish models we looked at that were eating together every night. And I know other co-housing communities that we visit in the UK eat once a week, some do it once a month. So yeah, we are more involved probably on a daily basis with each other than some communities. Obviously, for some of us, that means it takes up less time because we're not cooking every night. So some of us would say we have more time on our hands because we've got that more shared lifestyle. So I think it's interesting whether it's creates more or less of that shared life, because I think it's just different approach in one sense. But my feeling has always been that I want to be in co-housing because it does have a shared life, but I have my own front door. My wife is particularly more introverted than I am and really needs that front door. We've lived in intentional communities in shared spaces, living in shared house, much more like Braziers. And we found that quite difficult, not having that space. So I think it is, for me, I want that shared life. I think an individual lifestyle it's hard when it's a written question, isn't it? To know what you mean by individual lifestyle. I would say not completely to have an individual lifestyle, or why would you move into co-housing to have a completely individual lifestyle? I think part of the great thing about co-housing is that meeting people, those conversations you have when you are going down the garden, there's other people around, or you're picking some veg, or you're picking up the post or whatever. Those conversations internationally is what you want. You want that to have that community. For me, I want it to be a different variety of people. I don't want it to be people just like me. I want it to be a range of different people, different ages, different lifestyles.
I just wondered, Penny, if you've got anything to add from that, from your observation. I mean, I know you visited various different places, some of which are, say, or co-housing groups, some of which aren't. Have you got anything to add on that? Have you observed that it's easier to live a sort of, whether you've got a wider option in lifestyle in a co-housing group than a more communal setup?
Yeah, I really like what Ben said about actually, because you're sharing labor together, it actually frees up more time. So in theory, you can have more time doing the things that you're interested in because you're relieved from things like cooking duties a bit more often. I think my observation is that certainly you have to coordinate with other people in a more complex way than you would if on average living with a nuclear family or living with a partner. You've got to consider other people's kind of tolerances for tidiness, or maybe you've made a commitment to come to a meeting, so you have to make sure you come to that meeting. So I think there are going to be certain constraints and certain ways you have to coordinate. But I think one of the big appeals of co-housing is that you have that balance of privacy and communality. Though certainly when I've interviewed people who live in co-housing communities, one of the things they say that they've struggled with a little bit is finding that balance. And sometimes community life can get very intense and they feel a need to, take a step back and have a breather. So I think it can be, from what I've observed, a bit of a balancing act.
Okay, I'd quite like to throw this out, and I mean, there are people here from other co-housing groups. I wonder if Phil, do you live an individual lifestyle, or do you live a more collective one?
Oh, I'd say very individual, really. There are obviously limits on individuality. I remember when we were forming the group, we had quite a prominent member who was determined that he wanted a detached earth shelter building structure. And you in terms of building, you obviously have to make compromises. You have to agree on what's affordable and how it will look and things like that. But the people are very distinct individuals within the community. It's just that you have to get together to do the stuff that you do together. And that doesn't have to be everyone. Actually. There's an awful lot of little breakout activity. So not everyone's in the carpool, not everyone owns the beach hut, things like that. But so there's quite a lot of individual shaping of their involvement in the community. And there's also a lot of variation in terms of how people contribute to the community. Though I think everyone does contribute in one way or the other. But no, I think there's plenty of individuality, but there's also that communal aspect, which I think it's within a community that individuals can thrive, if I might put it like that.
Yeah, great. Just a quick question, Phil. How big is your beach hut? How many people can you get inside it?
Well, the thing about beach hut is you're not often inside it. It's basically so you spilling to there's like a walkway and then there's the beach.
Yeah.
Right.
I wasn't expecting it to be sort of co-beach hut. Okay.
You just
Could become a thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Phil. I'm going to go back to Martin. I wanted to ask you. I mean, you wrote a couple of chapters in the book. Was there anything that you particularly wanted? What was a message you really wanted to get over to people about the last 10 years co-housing development?
That people underestimate co-housing's success. I think that people can sometimes talk about co-housing, that it's so demanding, so time-consuming, so extensively expensive or whatever. They sometimes downplay what it's already doing. And it seemed to me the first book was a brilliant example of what was around at the time. And there have been really good other things since then that's added to co-housing success, that it just felt right to remind people in projects' own words, from their own experiences, what they've done. It felt like what we wanted to do was just give a platform for people to describe what motivated them, because not everything is always motivated in the same way. And a project like Cannock Mill has come from a very different background than Chaco in Leeds, but they both display some really, really inspiring success, and they're both fed by the same values, and they both include the same sorts of things. It's just a very, very different built form and contributory membership. And co-housing's doing that time after time after time. So even though the wider context is problematic, even though it's expensive, even though it's monopolized by other interests, if people get the chance to pull some of those things together, they just succeed. And it's just right to give people the platform to talk about it.
Still muted, sorry. Don't quite know who might answer this question, but it's, is there anything you would have liked to have seen in the book that's not there? Is there anything we missed about co-housing today? I realised nobody's mentioned the UK co-housing network as something that's happened in the last decade. There was a sort of very looser network 10 years ago. Now it's much more formal. And that has upped the profile, certainly in sort of local authority and government levels. I don't know, Penny, if there's anything you've seen in the co-housing movement I mean, you weren't there 10 years ago, I know, but that you think has changed, which sort of leads on to a next question that people might want to address, is where do you think co-housing's going?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, of course, it's an excellent book. I think it's populated very appropriately. But actually, one thing that is in a way on my wish list is to have a supportive voice of local or national government in the book, talking about what can be done or what they're going to do to support co-housing, essentially. And that's kind of that's a wish for what would happen, or I know there's been a little bit of support, what can continue happening to build the momentum and make co-housing more accessible for more people. And I think in terms of your second question about, where would I like to see co-housing develop over the next 10 years? Ultimately, and probably this is a bit ambitious for 10 years' time, but ultimately what I would really love is that if somebody wants to join a co-housing community, it's a viable choice for them to do so. What that actually means is that affordable options exist abundantly enough, and that there's enough co-housing communities in the UK that people don't have to move to a different region just to live in co-housing. And I think that what's linked to that is that co-housing is embedded in our systems more, so, financially, legally, policy-wise, culturally as well. And we should absolutely wholeheartedly celebrate the amazing schemes that we have. But also it's important to look at that systemic level and see what other levers we can push. So as you referenced, Chris, some of the work that the UKCN has been doing, pushing those levers to help ease the path as other groups come up. And I'd also like to see kind of more options for different types of co-housing, more experimentation, more post-occupancy evaluations as well, so that we can understand what is working and where we can improve.
You're touting for some more research work.
Yeah, absolutely. Naturally. Yes,
there's a quick question that's sort of related to that's coming. How do people join a co-housing group? What's the mechanism for joining? How? In fact, do you know, how did you join your group in Harrow?
So I think I found the group on the UKCN website. That's the UK Co-housing Network website. And I think that's not a bad way to see what's going on and to reach out. So that's one route. And then I think different groups will have different options or mechanisms for joining. So I think in active co-housing sites, they'll usually have some open days you can attend, and then you can join a waiting list. And you usually visit several times and get to know the community. And then when a house becomes free, if you like them and they like you, then you may have an opportunity to move in. But I suppose there'll be a few different ways in which you can join groups.
And some of them will require you to buy a unit. Some of them will rent a unit. Just a quick question, Ben, how do I join GraceWorks?
I echo what Penny said actually about the problem of needing more co-housing, because I think people quite often get asked, how did you advertise for members? How did your group start? We never advertised once. It was just word of mouth from people, and then we actually stopped any new members because we reached capacity of the number of members we wanted within the community. So it'll be a number of years and a number of more building work or more housing units out of the accommodation, the buildings that we currently got, before we could have new members. And I think that's one of the issues. So echoing what Penny said, that actually what we need is more projects and more established projects and clearer ways of how you can get affordable co-housing. Because one of the things that we haven't decided in our processes yet, but we're not looking at as a community of being, we want to be outside the housing market. We're not going to go up with market value, because as a community we're not, we believe that housing should not be a commodity in that sense, but obviously that does cause problems, people moving in and out of it, or moving out of it particularly.
So in fact, both of you are talking from sort of developing group, so aren't you? I mean, you've got people together to develop the group. I mean, Forge Bank, we're in a situation where we've been going for 12 years. I mean, you can only really join us if there's a vacancy, if somebody leaves, and that can either be a unit for sale or a unit for rent. So we're in a very different position. I mean, and we're moving to a situation where a significant portion of the people weren't involved with the development. I mean, there's a lot, certainly in the practical guide that was produced in conjunction with the co-housing network. There was a lot about involvement in design, involvement, and how important that is to the group. We're now moving to a position where a good third to a half of our membership weren't involved in that process. They come with a different set of expectations. They see us as we are, not as we dreamed we might be at the beginning. In fact, my observation would be they're much more satisfied with the community than as original members were, because we had a fantasy about what it was going to be like, and either it lived up to, didn't live up to, or even exceeded our expectations. So different relationships. It's quite interesting. I've never really unpicked this sort of co-housing only works if people are involved in designing it, because down the road, people come who weren't involved. Okay, I've got a difficult question to me. Thank you.
Chris, I'm going to come back to something. One of the other bits of the question you asked before, which is, the future.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I think what co-housing really does need to do as a concept, still trying to be discussed in the same way as housing cooperatives have been discussed for a long time. And nowadays, people more readily talk about community land trusts as a particular approach to a kind of community housing initiative. For co-housing to be talked about more routinely and more from a sense of people expecting it to be in conversations, it really needs to feature in more of the new build areas. Although we can talk about rehabilitation of properties, like Ben's saying, GraceWorks did, like the property we're sitting in here in Braziers. There is nevertheless a lot of new build developments still on the cards, still massive areas that are in the planning frameworks. For very large urban developments, town extensions or city extensions. And co-housing needs to feature within the opportunities for groups to then seize a part of that area for a co-housing development, so that it can be seen much more routinely as one kind of neighbourhood amongst a variety of neighbourhoods that might be developer-led, that might be mainstream designed and spewed out, if you like, but nevertheless that it's been able to secure some land to do a different kind of development.
It is starting to happen, Martin. I was randomly selected to do the local council's housing needs survey, and one of the questions was, would I be interested in living in a co-housing project? And this is the local council asking me. I mean, I think they're prompted by the fact that we're there, and it's very surprising. I said, of course I would like to live in a co-housing project. But so it is starting to percolate through in some areas where there has been an awareness of the advantages of the development.
Can I just add one more thing on that as well? I totally agree. And I think with the new Labour government, there might be some interesting opportunities. Labour's laid out these mandatory housing targets, which I think there's hopefully a national recognition that this is needed, but probably sort of on the ground level, that's probably going to be really controversial, as people don't always like, new developments and new housing near to them. And one thing that co-housing is really good at is getting neighbourhood buy-in for new developments, because people are getting to meet residents beforehand, and they also, may gain a neighbourhood asset through a common house as well. So making co-housing a part of large new developments, which will be mandatory for local authorities, could help with bringing those resistant neighbours on side more. And one thing I saw recently that the UK Co-housing Network is advocating for is that 5% of large new sites are to be allocated for community-led housing, which I actually learned yesterday is the norm in Denmark and in Amsterdam as well. So there is precedent for this kind of thing.
You just mentioned common house and things. A question has popped up about how important in sort of co-housing and co-housing design is the common house, and particularly the design and positioning of it within the community. I mean, I know this gets talked about a lot, but I mean, Ben, you were in a position where you almost your common house is the first thing that's there. You can't choose where it's going to be on the site.
No, we can't choose where it's being on site, but it is kind of the first building you come to as well on site. So we're quite lucky in that sense. I think it's essential. I really do. That is, for me, I think the thing that made me sad when I was talking to some other housing groups talking about that's where they didn't have enough money to build the common house they wanted, or they had to build a smaller common house. And I think that's really sad, because I think even though it's not ideal for us because of the dining room and the kitchen dining facilities, we can comfortably all eat together. And I think that if you can't do that, and when I've been visiting and part of other co-housing groups and intentional communities, when you can't eat well together, or it's too crowded, or it's too noisy, then that's when you don't do it. So I think it's core. I really do think it's core, and it's central. And for me, that's what makes co-housing. I know different people have different opinions on that, but it's having that common house and those common facilities are really core to what we wanted to do. And I think, yeah, if I was designing from scratch or look at the greenfield site, I think I would have wanted to design it so the traffic led through it. So that you got those incidental meetings as well as just meetings and eating together. So for me, I think it's key, and I would want it in a place so it is the passageway through, so people have to use it.
Can I invite you to comment, Monica? I mean, I know you've struggled with the common house and you're self-building it now, I understand.
Hello, thank you. Yes, it's quite true. We did struggle, are struggling, and are building it ourselves. So it's very interesting to hear about groups that were unable to, and we have experienced that our wish to do things together is limited by not having that common house. And so we're very much looking forward. I mean, it's smaller than we would have chosen. You know, the original design we put out was larger, but something is better than nothing. And we have got the possibility of building another little bit alongside it to augment the amount of common house space. So I think that I would underline what Ben says, that it's core, it's essential. And in a way, the building of our own common house is actually lovely, because some of us have sort of like got our hands in the clay that we've plastered the internal walls with, and it's really hands-on, and a lot of people have done little bits here and there. So although we wished it had been built and we could just have it as part of our everyday life, it will have a different role in all our hearts, because we've put ourselves into it in a way. So definitely core.
And are you imagining that this might carry on, that you might do maintenance as a group? Or, I mean, I know groups do different things. Some people buy in maintenance, some people have a maintenance team. Well, do you think this is going to help you do that sort of thing collectively?
Well, I think the thing is that we are much bigger than we originally planned. We've got 53 homes. We didn't aim to have 53 homes, but we had the land that we could build 53 homes, and we're still struggling to build a common house even with that many homes. But I'm sorry, I have forgotten the question.
How much maintenance are you going to do, and has it helped building your own?
So the plan will be that we, whatever we can do, we do. If it's beyond our skills, then obviously we will pay somebody, but where we can do it ourselves, we will. And of course, because we've built the common house, we know what's gone into the structure. Yeah. So we know, exactly where we can screw into wood and where not. There's intimacy really with the whole
And
building.
you know who to blame for the snagging and the you know whose door to go and knock on.
Something
I
like
see you've
that.
yeah, thanks, Monica. Phil, I see you've got your hand up. Did you want to chip in on the Common House question?
Okay, I think the design of the Common House, but and also the designing of where traffic is absolutely crucial to what's really special about co-housing.
I think it's good.
To
Yeah.
make for those informal, you know, you've got the privacy of your home, but you're constantly bumping into neighbours through just natural reactions. And I think we heard in one of the sessions, either yesterday or the day before, about the greater density of, you know, in co-housing space because of dealing with the motor car in a rather different way. And I think the design is so crucial. And, you know, your lovely corridor at Forge Bank is an example of that, I'd say.
Great, thanks, Phil. I'm going to go back to our books, and as we're here to launch a book, I'm going to ask Penny first. Who's this book aimed at? Who should be reading this book? Who when you were writing your article, who did you think you were writing it for?
I honestly think anyone who's interested in co-housing. I know it's a somewhat convenient answer. Anybody. But so the book it's very practical. So it's actually full of practical information, real nuts and bolts stuff about, you know, so we have Bridport on how they funded and built their common house. We have stories from various co-housing groups, their kind of origin stories, how they went from here to there. We have the lived experience of co-housing. So Chris has a chapter in there as well about Forge Bank, you know, several years after moving. And I think that's interesting if you want to do it yourself. And then also if you're studying co-housing, if you're researching co-housing, then hearing that lived experience is really rich too. And then, you know, you have several thought pieces, which are kind of people summing up where they see the sector and the various challenges of the sector and some of the debates. So I really think it's kind of capturing this snapshot in time of, you know, where co-housing has come at the moment. So I think it has a real mass appeal.
Martin, you were the guest editor. Who did you think the book was aimed at?
Yeah, I was trying to remember if I've got a clear answer to this. I think it was always designed, in my mind, to be read by people who want to be part of co-housing groups. That people who want to hear how others have done it and what could they glean from those stories for their own on-the-ground developments. Whether it was things they can copy or whether things they can avoid. Nevertheless, hearing about those practical bits and pieces and using that in their own day-to-day progress. Fundamentally that. I think it wasn't designed to be a book that's going to be read by government policy strategists in fine detail. There's a different sort of argument to put to their minds. Probably not the bankers. There's a different sort of discussion to have with bankers. I think it's primarily for people who have been part of co-housing community schemes, created co-housing communities, and people who want to do that, exchanging their views together.
Have you put your hand up, Kirsten, to tell us who you thought the book was for?
Yeah, you know, I like to butt in. No, I think that the points that Penny and Martin made were excellent. And I do think that this book, so there was a previous book that I know that some of the people in this room, including Martin and Chris and Jonathan, were involved in something called the Practical Guide to Co-housing, which was commissioned by the Co-housing Network. And at one point I thought, oh gosh, 2 books on top of each other, that's quite close. But this book is such a good complementary book, because the practical guide is exactly that. It's a very practical guide. It takes people step by step, you know, up through all of the different stages of co-housing. Whereas this book, I feel, is like the lived experience of co-housing. And because it has those contributions that are made by people who have actually walked the walk and done the journey, I think that it's quite encouraging. Even the bits where people talk about how tough it is, or how you know, how challenging some parts of that journey are. They're real human beings who have really taken that journey, and they are writing about their lived experience of doing that in all those different ways. You know, so you know, right the way through from Ben, you know, Ben's writing is lovely, but there was a bit where I remember thinking, oh gosh, because you lost quite a lot of money at one point trying to buy a building that you ultimately didn't buy. And I think that for people who perhaps are at the earlier stages of that journey, they'll learn, because they'll go, oh God, you know, that's a potential pitfall. But equally, they may go, okay, so we won't be overly demoralized by these pitfalls, because actually it is possible to get past them, and things do happen, and we can make that journey as in its complete form, and we can also get there. And then we've got existing, you know, we've got Bridport Co-housing and Cannock Mill sitting here in this meeting with us. You know, you guys have moved in. You know, it's they are also inspirational stories that allow people to see that the thing that perhaps they are aspiring to is a reality, and it's done by real human beings, you know, not big companies, but proper real people. Thanks, Chris.
I'd add to that you know, there's also, it's also been an opportunity to show the different kinds of schemes that have come forward using existing buildings, not just GraceWorks, but one on the brink, you know, using an existing building and adding to it, to still have an urban dimension to, or a rehabilitated urban dimension to co-housing development, and just showing the flexibility of what those values can do, even with existing buildings, and people's readiness to add to them.
Yeah, whilst I'm just going to come back to Kirsten on this. I mean, whilst you say the book is actually full of first-hand experience, actually what you bring to it is actually a different view of it from the outside, because you've come to looking at intentional community from an academic route, rather than a sort of participant. I'd quite like to go back to a question we had earlier and give it to you. Is what do you see the opportunities for co-housing in the next 10 years?
Okay, so it's a good question, and as you know, my research is quite broad. So I'm equally as interested in, say, for example, low impact development, or people living in yurts and benders, and people living in big house communes. So for me, co-housing is an option on a spectrum of options. But one of the things I think that is the beauty of co-housing is that it is twofold. One, it is an option, I think, that local authorities can look at, and they understand what it is, because it has such clear parameters, because it is what it is. It's a sort of a very well-defined product. It enables local authorities to kind of go, oh yes, we recognize this thing. And I think that the future might be that the more successful co-housing projects we have, and also the more research that we have, I'm not even looking for this as a job for research, but we know from early research that living collectively in healthy ways increases our health, it reduces stress, it can actually make people's well-being and healthy years, I think there's a name for that, longer, that we can actually have better lives when we share them with others in a way that is created through co-housing and other forms of collective living. And I think that, you know, we just need people to connect those dots, to kind of go, you know what, actually, this is something that will allow people to take control of their lives and give them somewhere that's healthy and productive to live, that they feel in control of, and it will reduce potentially social care burdens, etc., etc., etc. And I think that that tipping point gets ever closer, or at least I hope it does.
Yeah, when I do a presentation to sort of housing professionals and they don't quite get it, I go, look, it's sheltered housing for ordinary people, and they go, oh yeah, we understand that. You got your hand up, Tom, from On the Brink.
Yeah, hi.
Do you want to chip in?
I was feeling a bit in need to sort of put a counter thing to Kirsten, because I mean, I think that the notion that living together with other people is less stressful than shutting your door and, you know, being a nice little nuclear family with a dog or something like that. I think I'm not alone in finding it at times, you know, a swing, you know, a pendulum or whatever it is, you know. Sometimes it's really good. Like today we had a work day in the garden and got through a fantastic amount of work. Other times we're just squabbling, you know. If you know, no one's getting their own way. It's like you know, consensus leading to you know, it's just sort of like just a muddled, you know, instead of coloured, it's like mudded all the colours in together sort of thing. I don't know what colour would emerge. So I think it's recognition of those ups and downs, because you have to just somehow, you know, this is where we live, and everyone's got their own stuff that comes out of the left field, which they stick with, you know, stick at. So it was really interesting with the Earth Song presentation yesterday, with the mechanisms that they've had to develop, you know, some of which we've got here, but it doesn't reduce the stress. Sometimes going through those mechanisms increases the stress. So I think people should go into the, you know, co-housing world expecting, you know, the slings and arrows, as well as, you know, as well as the whatever it is, you know, the sunlit uplands or whatever. So it's not stress reduction, it's stress sort of like ups and downs, really.
A bit of oscillating stress, Tom.
Yes, I did. Well, you know.
Yeah, yes, Tom. Clearly, if academia think it's all rosy, we're doing too good a job on the PR side, aren't we?
Well, that's science. That's right.
But yeah. I probably would say where Kirsten's right on that, though, or the research is definitely right. I think it may be stressful at times, but so is family life. But I think actually when it comes to longevity and healthy lives, it still prolongs it, because actually it's still living real life. It's not being isolated with nobody around you. And, you know, we've known that loneliness is going to, you know, is increasingly becoming one of the biggest killers. And that's not just amongst old people anymore. We're now
sometimes
seeing
loneliness is
amongst...
just a dream. It's just a dream, you know. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Let's have a bit of loneliness.
Tom, we'll offer a counselling session at the end of this.
That's cool. Thank you.
Okay, Phil, did you want to chip in on this? You've got your hand up.
Supporting what Ben said, I think the advantages of it may come from just the engagement and actually a bit of conflict. There's nothing like that to really get you engaged.
Yep.
And you also are changed by it, because you don't get your way, which can be very frustrating, but also probably good for you in the long run. So I do think those benefits are there. It's just that they're not there because it's all lovey-dovey and smooth sailing. Could I just come back to why I wanted Cannock Mill to be in this book? Because I felt it was important to have an example of a project like Cannock Mill, which was probably seems a bit you know, bourgeois and posh for the normal diggers and dreamers, But I thought it was important that this is a possibility, and if we're really going to up the numbers of co-housing communities, it has to have that aspect in there as well. So I was really quite keen to be involved in this.
Yeah, great, Phil. I don't know about too bourgeois and posh. I mean, look at the room that Penny's in.
Yeah, true.
How long have we got, Kirsten?
I think if we go for probably at least probably about another 10 minutes, and then we
Okay.
can maybe have a wrap up, or if anybody's got any pressing questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat. And if you're in the room at Braziers, you can always ask, you can always put your hand up and ask a question from the room.
Or ask Jonathan.
Just a plug about the book, and just bearing back to the previous discussion that's touching on loneliness and things like that. There's a chapter in the book about some very searching research on co-housing's values to help loneliness in society, and how people can turn to co-housing in a very positive way to do things about that. So it's very, very well worth reading.
I'm asked as well. I think it's the diversity in the book. I think that's what really got me. I mean, I only got a full copy of it a few days ago, so I've been reading it and finishing it off on the car on the way here. But it was that diversity, and it was that difference. I think I was reading the chapter. Is it Marie that reads for the older people's cousin? Saying that, you know, she wouldn't want to live with her granddaughter full time. She's glad she can send her home at the end of the day. I'm paraphrasing what she says, but and then I read my chapter where we're going, you know, it has to be multi-generational. And I think it was brilliant to see that the different diverse, that there was a set of principles of co-housing that was similar across all those projects. You can see the through line, but equally on this edition, I think you can see that range of variety of different projects. And I think that's great to see that variety. And I think that's what makes this stand out from the first one, or like the co-housing guide, is this really shows that diversity.
Great. Thanks, Ben. I'm going to sort of put this, what might be a last round of questions to each of the contributors. And the question is, it's something about what, in terms of this idea of co-housing going forward, which we've touched on, what are the key debates that need to be had within co-housing? What are the key things that we need to address to see that vision of co-housing being expanded, either in numbers or to the sort of people who might get involved, making it more affordable? I'm starting to give the answers to my question now. Do you want to start, Ben? What do you think of the debate? What do you talk about at GraceWorks about how you develop? If you want to be specific, or feel free to be general about what you think co-housing needs to do.
I would say finance is one of those biggest problems. I think we're doing what we're doing because we've done it for, you know, we've got someone in, can have 7 households to start with, and we've done that for £1.3 million. And then I look in the book at others and look at the costs that are escalating. We went down that model because literally, as we were looking at a greenfield site, building materials literally doubled after COVID overnight. There was just, that cost was ginormous. Yeah. And I know that is it yourself, Chris, that's got the modular?
I'm working with another group, yes, that's looking at
doing the modular stuff. And so I think there is a really interesting piece for the future that I think when you look at some of I think it's one of the big Polish self-build kind of builders that does the modular homes, that literally they come over and they put them up within a fortnight. Going, actually, there must be some ways we can get some bigger co-housing projects without the risk, because actually there's companies out there now that can actually build good, sustainable homes that are modular. And there must be a way of some of that linking with co-housing to be able to create those communities. And if you've got a pattern for what common houses could look like in that as well. Yes.
Do you think in that need to address finance is linked into addressing issues to do with affordability? I mean,
Absolutely. I think affordability, I think for me, we looked around one co-housing project, myself and Dan were there, and they were talking about family units being £400,000. And then they were talking to me about engagement, wanting people to get more involved in the farming side like we do at ours. And we were going, well, we couldn't do that in your community at that cost, because all 4 adults in the group of us that we're looking at the time was like, we'd all have to work full time to pay that kind of mortgage. And then we still wouldn't necessarily make that work. So I think it's that balance of lifestyle that you want. It's got to be affordable, and it's got to be affordable to different groups of people. And I think that mix of how you put, I think there's still a piece about how you put affordable housing for rent in where you've not got, because I come from a social housing background. So I think that thing that always worries me is that piece in the local authority about housing registers. And that threat, you've got that kind of housing register conversation when you move into social landlords being part of it, is something I'd like to see, at a policy level, because I think it's really difficult and can really change a community if you are suddenly being told, So I would love to see the social housing. At the same time, I think you've got to have that conversation, and I know it's worked for some, but I know others have found that difficult. So I think that's one of those areas.
Penny, do you want to talk about what the key debates are? I mean, we seem to be touching on to things about affordability and inclusiveness. I mean, I think where something like Chaco has been a really different development. I don't know about broadening the base that co-housing is. I mean, I don't know if you know a lot about Chaco, but it's. I mean, I'm just wondering whether there's a debate there to be had as well about how we broaden the sort of people who are attracted to co-housing.
And actually, that was one of the chapters that really stood out for me in this book. The one by Yale Arbel, and then I think Bill Phelps and Pete Richardson. So they have a chapter on how to build a diverse community. Oh, sorry, how they built a diverse community in Chapeltown Co-housing in Leeds. Which is a tricky topic, and famously co-housing is pretty white and middle class. And in this chapter, they share in a really practical way how they went about it, and they share it with real openness about what they thought went well, what they found tricky, and where they're kind of still figuring things out as well. So I really appreciated their honesty and forthrightness in that chapter, and found it really valuable. And in terms of where I think key debates are in the sector, I think there's still no official definition for co-housing. And I think actually that, that's something that I think stakeholders in the industry can come together more on, to define a bit more clearly. I do think there is broad agreement about what co-housing is, that there's private space and communal space, that it's designed for social interaction, that it's managed by the community, and that there's co-design with the community as well. But then within that, I think there's some nuances and some debate to be had. So co-design, but what does that really mean? Like, how much co-design counts as co-design? We know that we want co-housing to be kind of human scaled and not enormous, but how, what's the balance between making a scheme viable and making it exist, and also keeping it human scale? Like, where's the benefits and the payoffs, and how is a community impacted as you increase or decrease the size? So I do feel, we have a broad understanding, but actually discussing together as a sector how to define co-housing, and understanding how the kind of outcomes, the benefits and the challenges from different models and different tenures will help us clarify what does success actually look like in co-housing. Because, one of the key things is, that you have this sense of community and support, which is lovely, but what does that really actually mean? I think more discussion on what co-housing is and what makes it good and what success looks like would be helpful.
And with your researcher's hat on, are you sort of saying what we need to do is we need to learn the lessons from the groups. We need to have some learning from the groups that have come forward in the last 10 years.
I think so. And I think one thing I've observed is that co-housing groups are excellent at being self-reflective and open about what they have found challenging. So yeah, I would be hopeful that there will be some great lessons learned from the communities that are in operation.
Martin, do you want to, what are the key debates in your mind that co-housing needs to address?
I think what is so really valuable about co-housing is its community focus. It starts from a desire to create communities and share communities, and goes about that in a very methodical way. And the problem at the moment in England is we talk about houses, and there's a debate about how many units go on what bit of kind of land. And we don't talk enough as a mature conversation about communities and neighbourhoods, creating places. And when that is talked about, it's very, very dominated by top-down professional attitudes, because that's the industries that are constantly around built development in this country. And I think if co-housing can increase its own focus on how it creates dynamic neighbourhoods, which are alternative to the mundanity of most conventional mainstream developments, it can demonstrate that actually it gets quality at a cheaper price and a more mature outcome than any of the other things around. But it's about saying to people, what you deliver is not good enough, and co-housing has got it. It's already there, and these communities are examples of it. And if you gave more opportunity for like-minded communities to come forward, they would demonstrate time and time again it's replicable. And yes, that needs to be affordable to include people from all kinds of economic backgrounds. And where communities are from mixed cultural backgrounds, they need to be reflective in co-housing neighbourhoods. But in this country, we don't all live in multicultural communities. There are communities that are solely white, just as much from a place where I live and come from, and my wife's from an Indian community. In Leicester, there are whole neighbourhoods that are fundamentally non-white. And it's just appropriate for co-housing communities in some of those areas to be reflective of their neighbourhood people from that area. You know, co-housing's big enough to do that. We don't need to try and artificially insert a cultural mix when there isn't one there, but we certainly need to try and make sure co-housing reflective of inclusive communities when that's the neighbourhood it's going to spring from.
I mean, I do think that is a big debate within co-housing. I see, Phil, you've got your hand up. What are the debates you're having at Cannock Mill? What is the key discussions?
This isn't a key discussion, and it's not something I would normally raise in terms of the challenges. But thinking about what we went through, it is so hard to find a good builder who won't go bust, who can build to a high standard, who knows about working with people. And I really wish there was a really good cooperative builder that had worked with a number of co-housing groups, that was, trusted and had some expertise and would work well with people through the difficulties that will always come, because building is, it's a wonder anything gets built when, in retrospect. But that would be really good to have, someone out there that had developed some expertise at working with groups and building to co-housing standards.
Yeah, I mean, there are one or two developers town who did the Cambridge scheme who are sort of sniffing around the edges, I might call it, looking at whether they want to specialise in or get some experience in that. I'm showing my prejudice here. I've got a question which I'm going to sort of try and round up on and answer myself. there's a question from Chris Austin asking whether there's a sort of he says, is there a limit to inclusiveness given that you're trying to share things? How much can you do that? And I'd say that that's almost the fault line in co-housing that you have to navigate, is that you're saying you want to respect people's private spaces, but you want them to share things. And there is almost an inbuilt tension in that. And yes, if you've got people who don't share the values, it becomes that tightrope, that fault line becomes much harder to negotiate with people. And at any one time, I think you've got people moving across that fault line. There are times when people want to be much more private. I mean, there are members of Forge Bank Co-housing who I probably haven't actually seen for 3 months. And there are other people who I see on a daily basis. And I know that will change who those individuals are. I just know from 10 years of experience that people are moving across that line of between shared things and how much they want to share of their lives and how much they want to be private in their lives. And I think that is where the tension lies, where the tension comes out. And how well as a group you manage to negotiate that is how inclusive you can be within your group. Yeah, that's I don't know if anybody else wants to try and grapple with that question.
It's
Are you reading the book? Is the answer in the book?
Yeah, the answer is in the book. So I can say this with confidence because I'm quoting someone else. But I think it's a good quote. So this is a quote actually from Chris's article by Laird Shaw about the limits of diversity. And he says, almost all cooperative groups aspire to hold diversity as a core value, but how much diversity can you stand? Sure, you allow pets, but what about alligators who eat small dogs and cats? How about people who can't stand garlic in community meals or they'll throw up? More tenderly, how many people suffering from mental health challenges can you realistically accommodate? The key here is figuring out how to have a compassionate and authentic conversation about what's possible when you think you're close to the edge. It's work to stretch to include people who are different from each other, and not everyone is inspired to stretch the same amount or in the same directions.
Yeah, okay. Are we running up against time, Kirsten? Have we had our 10 minutes?
I think that's a really nice note to finish on, actually. I think that's a really nice one. You know, ultimately, it's something that is developing, and I very much hope that we can do this all over again in 10 years' time, and we will be celebrating some completely different things, but good things. But thank you very much. Thank you, Chris, for excellent chairing and for fielding. My apologies if anybody had questions that we didn't quite get round to. Thank you to all of the people who contributed to the book. You should, if you have not already, get a copy of that through the post. Thank you for the people at Braziers for spending time with us this evening. And that's the end.